Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about changes in wage rates and salaries and some things to consider when making those changes, whether you can make them, when you should make them, how you should make them. So what are some things that people should consider when updating employees' wages, current employees especially?
Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, there's wage increases, which the law doesn't really restrict when you do that. You can always give somebody a raise. Um, I would say so it's not really a legal issue so much as it is something you want to make sure that your employees know about, and it's an opportunity to further develop the relationship with employees that are getting raises. So I wouldn't do it in a vacuum. I would make sure that there's recognition of the employee and appreciation, and there's not saying it needs to be kind of a public fanfare type situation, but at least for that employee, say, hey, you're doing good work. We really appreciate what you're doing. Keep up the good work. Here's a raise. And I do think it's an opportunity to, engage that employee further. And presumably it's someone you want to engage if you're giving them a raise. On the flip side, with wage reductions, there's obviously a host of considerations that go into that. From a technical standpoint, on the legal side of things, is you have to provide advance notice of reductions in pay. And every state has a slightly different version of that rule. Some states are 1 week, some states are, 1 day, some states are a little vague, but there's some best practices. In Maryland, the rule is at least 1 full pay period of advance notice. And we talked a ton about this at the beginning of COVID when there were a lot of belt tightening measures that companies were taking because of the unknown. So that's really the legal ramification, or legal consideration with respect to um, the mechanics of reducing one's wages.
Yeah, and so a couple other things to consider as well are just if you're reducing someone's wages, why are you reducing them? So you mentioned COVID, obviously that had happened when, there's a downturn in business. That could be a reason. Another reason could be performance or some type of issue with the employee, or maybe their role is changing or something's changing. But you want to, just like a lot of other things we talk about on OK at Work, you want to look at, if you're doing it for one employee for a certain reason, are you doing it with other similarly situated employees? Are you just, honing in on one specific employee for some reason? And you're saying it's X reason, but that doesn't really check out when you look at the full group of employees. You're really just singling this person out. Is that got an appearance of discrimination or some type of issue there? So something you definitely want to be conscious of. And from a messaging perspective, when you're raising someone's pay, those are often the more fun conversations to have. When you're reducing it, having a plan for how that's going to be communicated, how it's going to be documented, so that you do meet any notice requirements that you need to meet. So if you have a verbal conversation with someone, following up with them, making sure that it's been documented, making sure the employee is clear. Because obviously wages are a really sensitive issue to employees for good reason. And most people work for, not for the fun of it necessarily, though we hope we enjoy our jobs. It's a part of their livelihood and their family's life and things like that. So definitely important to be sensitive to these things when giving notice. And even if you're giving the bare minimum notice, you might want to consider giving more for those reasons as well.
Yeah, and one other aspect with respect to pay reduction considerations is whether it's the right thing to do to reduce the pay or to just move on from the employee. I mean, just like we've talked about a million times about making sure you're documenting and you're performance managing and you're talking to the employee about their struggles. If the pay reduction is for a performance reason, those same considerations apply. It's the same kind of type of steps you would take to insulate yourself against a claim of discrimination. But if you're going through those steps, because there is a performance issue, the question really is, does reducing this person's pay solve the problem? Is it likely to change their performance, or should I just bite the bullet now and move on? And obviously that's a case by case consideration, but again, it just kind of gets back to one of our common themes, is just document, manage, be proactive. And it'll allow you to make, have flexibility in the decision if you're faced with it at some point.
And one last thing to just kind of mention in closing as well is if there's an employment agreement, you might have spelled out wages in that agreement. So something to also take a look at, because if you're contractually agreed to pay a certain amount and you didn't leave yourself flexibility to change that amount, you might need the employee to agree. So something to consider as well, both on the front end when doing an employment agreement, that you don't want to maybe put yourself into that position unless you plan to put, unless you're intentionally doing so. But then also when you go to do a reduction, make sure you ask yourself the question, like, is there an employment agreement here? We should check it and make sure we haven't agreed contractually to continue to provide a certain wage. Well, thanks, Russell. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.